October 1942. Camp 30, Bowmanville, Ontario. The wind howled across Lake Ontario, carrying with it the first bitter promise of a Canadian winter. Inside the prisoner of war camp, tensions had been building for weeks. Nobody could have predicted that within hours, one of the most bizarre confrontations of World War II would unfold, a battle that would be fought not with bullets or bayonets, but with the most Canadian weapon imaginable. The German prisoners had been arriving at Camp 30 for months. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were U-boat commanders who had terrorized the Atlantic, Luftwaffe pilots who had dropped bombs on London, and Wehrmacht officers who had led divisions across Europe. Men like Otto Kretschmer, the most successful submarine commander in history, with 47 Allied ships to his name. Men like Horst Elfi, a decorated naval officer who had survived the sinking of his own vessel. These were the elite of the German military, proud, defiant, and absolutely unwilling to be humiliated. The Canadians guarding them were a different breed entirely. Many were farm boys from Saskatchewan and Alberta, lumberjacks from British Columbia, and factory workers from Ontario who had volunteered when their country called. They had been told this assignment was cushy, safe, far from the killing fields of Europe where their brothers in arms were fighting and dying. But safe does not mean simple, and what was about to happen would test every ounce of their resolve, their creativity, and their uniquely Canadian approach to problem solving. The trouble started thousands of miles away, on the rocky shores of the English Channel. On August 19, 1942, nearly 5,000 Canadian troops landed at Dieppe in what would become one of the most controversial operations of the entire war. The raid was a disaster. Within 9 hours, more than 900 Canadians lay dead on the beaches, with nearly 2,000 more captured by German forces. The beaches ran red with Canadian blood, and back in Germany Adolf Hitler was watching closely. When German forces captured those Canadian soldiers at Dieppe, they found something that would set off a chain reaction of retaliation that would stretch across the Atlantic Ocean. A Canadian officer, despite explicit orders to the contrary, had carried his operational orders into battle. Those orders contained a directive that captured German prisoners should have their hands bound during transport to prevent escape or resistance. 3 German prisoners were captured, their hands tied, and during an alleged escape attempt, they were shot and killed, their hands still bound. Hitler exploded with rage when he received the reports. He viewed it as a war crime, an execution of bound prisoners, a violation of the Geneva Convention. He immediately issued orders that all Canadian prisoners of war in German custody were to be shackled in retaliation. Photographs were taken of Canadian POWs with their hands bound in chains, photographs that were sent to the International Red Cross, photographs that made their way to Ottawa and London. The Canadian government faced an impossible choice. They could accept this treatment of their soldiers or they could respond in kind. On October 8, 1942, the order came down from Ottawa to the commandant of Camp 30, Lieutenant Colonel James Taylor. 100 German officers were to be shackled as retaliation for the German treatment of Canadian prisoners. It was a political decision made by diplomats and generals far from Bowmanville, but it would be Taylor and his men who would have to enforce it. Taylor was a career military man, 43 years old, with a reputation for fairness and discipline. He had served in the First World War and knew the horrors of combat. He also knew that the men under his guard were not criminals. They were prisoners of war, entitled to certain protections under international law. But orders were orders, and on the morning of October 10, he summoned the senior German officer, Captain Zur See George Friemel, to his office. Friemel was a naval officer, tall and ramrod straight, with the bearing of Prussian nobility. He had commanded warships in the North Sea and carried himself with the dignity that his rank demanded. When Taylor explained the order, Friemel's face turned to stone. He refused. He would not provide volunteers to be shackled. It was beneath the honor of German officers, he declared. It was a humiliation that no soldier should endure. Taylor tried reason. He explained that this was not his decision, that it came from the highest levels of government, that it was a response to German actions. Friemel was unmoved. Taylor then approached Otto Kretschmer, the legendary U-boat ace whose exploits were known throughout the naval warfare community. Kretschmer, only 30 years old but already a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, listened politely and then refused with the same cold determination. Taylor approached Hans Hefiel, another senior officer. Another refusal. The word spread through the camp like wildfire. The Canadians were going to shackle 100 officers by force. In the prisoner barracks, men who had faced depth charges and anti-aircraft fire, who had survived their ships sinking in the frozen Atlantic, who had parachuted behind enemy lines, began to prepare for resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor had no choice. If the Germans would not volunteer, he would have to take them by force. He ordered his guards to prepare. They would enter the barracks and forcibly shackle 100 officers. But as Taylor and his men approached the main mess hall where the German officers had gathered, they realized that this was not going to be simple. Nearly 4,000 German prisoners had barricaded themselves inside. They had torn apart furniture to create clubs and improvised weapons. They had pried iron bars from window frames. They had broken table legs and fashioned them into bludgeons. They had created a fortress, and they were prepared to defend their honor with whatever means they had available. Horst Elfi, Otto Kretschmer, and the other leaders stood at the front. They had organized the men into defensive positions. Some guarded the doors. Others held the windows. They had created barricades from overturned tables and bunks. The message was clear. If the Canadians wanted to shackle them, they would have to fight for it. Taylor faced a nightmare scenario. He had perhaps 200 guards immediately available at the camp. They were outnumbered, and if this turned into a full-scale battle with firearms, men would die on both sides. International law prohibited the shooting of prisoners except in the most extreme circumstances. This was not an escape attempt. This was a protest, a rebellion, but not an act of war. If Canadian guards opened fire on unarmed prisoners, even prisoners wielding improvised weapons, it would be an international incident that could dwarf the original controversy at Dieppe. But Taylor also could not back down. If he retreated, if he allowed the prisoners to defy a direct order from the Canadian government, it would undermine the entire POW system. Camps across Canada held thousands of German and Italian prisoners. If word spread that prisoners could simply refuse orders and barricade themselves without consequence, the entire system would collapse. Taylor made a decision that would become legendary. He would not use firearms. He would not even use standard military weapons like bayonets or rifle butts. He needed something that would give his men a fighting chance against clubs and iron bars, something that could be used for defense and offense, something that could match the improvised weapons of the Germans without escalating to lethal force. And then it came to him, or perhaps it came to one of his sergeants, a solution so absurdly Canadian that it would become the stuff of legend. Hockey sticks. The Kingston military base was just 45 miles away. Taylor made the call. He needed reinforcements, approximately 100 men, and he needed hockey sticks, as many as they could find. Within 2 hours, trucks began arriving from Kingston. Soldiers piled out, confused by their orders but ready for action. And from the equipment storage, from the recreation halls, from anywhere they could be found, came hockey sticks. Wooden sticks, well-worn from countless games on frozen ponds and makeshift rinks. The most Canadian weapon imaginable. The soldiers formed up outside the mess hall. Each man was issued a hockey stick. Some of them could not help but grin despite the tension. They were going into battle armed with the same equipment they had used as boys playing shinny on farm ponds and city streets. But the grins faded when they saw the barricaded doors and windows, when they heard the shouts in German from inside, when they realized that the men inside were desperate and determined. Taylor gave them their orders. No firearms. No lethal force. They would break through the barricades and subdue the prisoners using only the hockey sticks and their own physical strength. Any man who exceeded these orders would face court-martial. This had to be done by the book, within the rules of engagement for POW guards, or it would not be done at all. The Canadians advanced. The first group reached the main entrance to the mess hall, where tables and chairs had been piled high against the doors. They began to tear down the barricade. From inside came a roar of defiance. The Germans knew what was coming. They had made their stand. They would not yield without a fight. The doors burst open. The Canadians poured in, hockey sticks raised. The Germans surged forward to meet them, wielding their improvised clubs and iron bars. And then, in the middle of a prisoner of war camp in rural Ontario, one of the strangest battles of World War II began. The clash was brutal and chaotic. Hockey sticks cracked against table legs. Men grappled and wrestled. The Canadians had training and organization on their side. Many of the guards were farm boys and working men, used to physical labor and no strangers to rough-and-tumble fights. But the Germans had numbers and desperation. They fought with the same courage and discipline that had made them formidable on the battlefields of Europe. A young Canadian private from Manitoba, barely 20 years old, found himself face to face with a German Luftwaffe officer twice his age. The German swung an iron bar. The Canadian blocked it with his hockey stick, the impact sending shock waves up his arms. He jabbed forward, catching the German in the ribs, not hard enough to seriously injure but hard enough to drive him back. Around them, dozens of similar confrontations played out. Otto Kretschmer stood near the center of the melee, not fighting directly but directing his men like he had once directed submarine crews in combat. He called out orders in German, organizing resistance, identifying weak points in the Canadian line. He was a tactical genius, and even in this absurd situation, his mind worked like a military calculator, assessing angles and opportunities. A Canadian sergeant, a former hockey player from Toronto who had once dreamed of playing professionally before the war intervened, moved through the chaos with surprising grace. His hockey stick became an extension of his body. He blocked, parried, struck with precision. He did not aim to injure but to subdue, to overwhelm. Years of playing defense on the ice had taught him how to use reach and leverage, and those skills served him now in the most unlikely of circumstances. The battle raged for hours. Neither side would yield. The Canadians would push forward, gaining ground, only to be driven back by a concentrated German counterattack. The Germans would mass at one point, trying to force an opening to escape the building, only to be met by a wall of Canadian guards with their hockey sticks forming a barrier. Men on both sides sustained injuries. Bruises, cuts, possible broken bones. But remarkably, no one was seriously hurt. The hockey sticks, for all their effectiveness as defensive weapons, were not designed to kill or maim. They could stun, they could hurt, but they were fundamentally less lethal than rifles or bayonets. The Germans, with their improvised weapons, were similarly limited. This was a battle of wills more than a battle of weapons. As the hours wore on, exhaustion began to set in. The Germans had been fighting for nearly 4 hours. The Canadians kept rotating fresh men in from outside, but the confined space of the mess hall meant they could not bring their full numbers to bear at once. The fight had reached a stalemate, and Taylor knew he needed something to break it. Water cannons. The fire equipment at the camp included high-pressure hoses. Taylor ordered them brought to the building. If he could not subdue the prisoners by force, perhaps he could make the conditions inside the mess hall so unbearable that they would surrender. The hoses were positioned at the windows and doors. On Taylor's signal, the water began to flow. High-pressure streams of freezing water blasted into the mess hall. In October in Ontario, the water was brutally cold, only a few degrees above freezing. The spray soaked everything and everyone inside within seconds. The Germans tried to hold their positions, but the water was relentless. It hammered against them, soaking their clothes, chilling them to the bone. The floor became slippery and treacherous. Men lost their footing and fell. The makeshift weapons became harder to grip with numb, wet hands. The temperature inside the building plummeted as the water continued to pour in. For another hour, the standoff continued. The Canadians kept the pressure on, literally. The water never stopped. The Germans, soaked and shivering, began to realize that they could not win this battle. They had made their point. They had shown their defiance. But continuing to resist in these conditions would accomplish nothing except their own suffering. Horst Elfi and Otto Kretschmer conferred. They were military men trained to assess tactical situations. They had fought the Allies to a standstill for hours, had shown that German officers would not meekly submit to humiliation. But they were also pragmatists. Their men were freezing. Some were injured. And ultimately, the Canadians had them trapped with overwhelming force available if needed. Continuing the fight served no purpose. Elfi approached the door under a makeshift white flag, a soaked piece of cloth torn from someone's shirt. He called out to Taylor. They needed to talk. Taylor agreed to a temporary ceasefire. The water stopped. The two men met in the doorway, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle. Elfi was direct. The German officers would agree to come out peacefully, but they demanded assurances. They wanted it known to the Red Cross and to the world that they had resisted, that they had not submitted willingly. They wanted medical attention for the injured. And they wanted Taylor's word that they would be treated with the respect due to military officers, even in shackles. Taylor agreed. He had his orders to carry out, but he had no desire to humiliate these men beyond what was necessary. They would receive medical care. The incident would be fully documented and reported through proper channels. And they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. One by one, the German officers emerged from the mess hall. They were soaked, exhausted, bruised, and battered. But they walked out with their heads high, maintaining their dignity even in defeat. The Canadians, equally exhausted, formed lines to process them. The shackles were applied to 100 officers as ordered, light restraints that would be removed after the political situation was resolved. As the prisoners were led away to their barracks, something unexpected happened. Several of the Canadian guards approached German prisoners they had just been fighting and offered cigarettes, blankets, assistance. The Germans, surprised, accepted. A Canadian corporal helped a limping German officer to the infirmary, the same officer who had struck him across the shoulders with a table leg hours earlier. A German lieutenant nodded respectfully to a Canadian sergeant who had bloodied his nose during the melee. There was a strange mutual respect that formed in the aftermath. The Canadians had shown restraint and creativity, fighting a battle without lethal weapons even when they could have simply shot their way through the resistance. The Germans had shown courage and solidarity, standing together even in captivity against what they saw as unjust treatment. Both sides had done their duty as they understood it, and both sides had conducted themselves, with few exceptions, according to the rules of warfare and military honor. The Battle of Bowmanville, as it became known, lasted approximately 5 hours from start to finish. The exact number of Germans involved remains disputed, with estimates ranging from 1,500 to 4,000 depending on the source. What is certain is that approximately 100 Canadian soldiers, armed primarily with hockey sticks and eventually supported by water hoses, subdued a much larger force of German prisoners without a single shot being fired and without any fatalities. Word of the battle spread quickly. In Germany, the Nazi propaganda machine attempted to portray it as evidence of Allied barbarism, guards attacking helpless prisoners with weapons. But the facts told a different story, one that even German prisoners confirmed to Red Cross inspectors. The Canadians had used minimum necessary force and had shown remarkable restraint. In Canada, the incident became a source of both pride and amusement. Hockey sticks as weapons of war perfectly captured the Canadian identity, that unique combination of toughness and civility, of being willing to fight when necessary but preferring to do so by the rules and with as little bloodshed as possible. Cartoons appeared in newspapers showing Mounties and soldiers wielding hockey sticks against the Axis powers. It became part of Canadian folklore. For the prisoners at Camp 30, life eventually returned to a tense normalcy. The shackling order was eventually rescinded after negotiations between the Allies and Germany through Swiss intermediaries acting as neutral parties. The Germans stopped shackling Canadian prisoners, and the Canadians reciprocated. The Battle of Bowmanville faded into the background of the larger war. But the men who were there never forgot it. Otto Kretschmer, who survived the war and lived until 1998, recounted the story in his memoirs. He spoke with a mixture of frustration at the circumstances and grudging admiration for the Canadian approach. He had fought the Royal Navy across the Atlantic, had faced depth charges and destroyer attacks, but being subdued by farm boys with hockey sticks was somehow the most uniquely memorable combat experience of his captivity. Horst Elfi, when interviewed years after the war, admitted that the battle had been futile from a practical standpoint but necessary from a moral one. The German officers had needed to show that they could not be treated arbitrarily, that their honor meant something even in captivity. The fact that the Canadians had understood this, had fought them without resorting to massacres or brutality, had earned his respect. For the Canadian Guards, many of whom went on to serve in combat units in Europe later in the war, the Battle of Bowmanville was a defining moment. They had been tested in an impossible situation, ordered to fight their own prisoners without using the tools of war, and they had found a solution that was effective, humane, and undeniably Canadian. When they told the story to their comrades fighting in Italy or France, they were often met with disbelief and laughter. Hockey sticks against German officers? Sounded like a joke. But it had happened and it had worked. The broader implications of the battle resonated throughout the war. It demonstrated that even in the brutal context of World War II, there were still rules, still boundaries, still a distinction between soldiers fighting under orders and war criminals acting without restraint. The Canadians at Bowmanville had been given legal authority to use lethal force if necessary to suppress the rebellion. They chose not to. That choice mattered. It also highlighted the strange brotherhood that existed among professional soldiers, even enemies. The German officers at Camp 30 were not Nazis in the ideological sense for the most part. They were military professionals who had fought for their country. The Canadians were similarly professional soldiers doing their duty. When the battle ended, both sides could recognize in each other the qualities they valued in themselves: courage, discipline, adherence to a code of honor. The hockey sticks themselves became minor relics. Some were kept by the soldiers who had wielded them, souvenirs of the strangest battle they would ever fight. A few ended up in military museums, displayed alongside more conventional weapons of war with plaques explaining their unlikely role in military history. At least one was allegedly signed by both Canadian guards and German prisoners who had participated in the battle, a unique artifact of cooperation amid conflict. In the years after the war, veterans from both sides occasionally met at reunions and commemorative events. Old soldiers who had once faced each other across barricades in a Canadian POW camp would shake hands, share drinks, and reminisce about that bizarre October day in 1942. The enmity that had driven nations to war faded in the face of shared experience and mutual survival. The story of the Battle of Bowmanville also entered Canadian popular culture. It was referenced in books, documentaries, and eventually internet forums where military history enthusiasts debated its details and significance. Some saw it as a humorous footnote, a quirky story to tell at parties. Others recognized it as something more profound, an example of how creativity and restraint can solve problems that violence alone cannot. For historians studying the treatment of prisoners of war during World War II, Bowmanville stands out as an example of how the system was supposed to work, even under stress. The Geneva Conventions were honored, even as they were tested. Prisoners were not executed for resisting. Guards were not court-martialed for refusing to shoot unarmed men. The diplomatic channels worked, eventually, to resolve the underlying dispute that had caused the crisis in the first place. The battle also illustrated the complex chain of events that could spiral out from a single incident. The Dieppe raid led to the discovery of orders about binding prisoners, which led to German retaliation, which led to Canadian counter-retaliation, which led to a riot in a POW camp in Ontario. Wars create these cascades of action and reaction, and the Battle of Bowmanville showed how even small decisions by individual soldiers could have international ramifications. Lieutenant Colonel James Taylor received commendations for his handling of the crisis. He had been placed in an impossible situation by political decisions made above his pay grade, and he had found a way to carry out his orders without causing a massacre. His decision to use hockey sticks, whether it was his own idea or suggested by subordinates, showed creative problem-solving under pressure. Military leadership is often about managing chaos and finding unconventional solutions, and Taylor exemplified those qualities. The guards who participated in the battle returned to their normal duties. Some volunteered for combat service and ended up fighting in Europe. Others remained in Canada for the duration of the war, guarding prisoners and maintaining security on the home front. But they all carried the story with them, a reminder that war is not always what you expect, that battles are not always fought with bullets, and that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that prevents killing rather than enables it. For the German prisoners, Camp 30 remained their home until the war ended. They organized classes, put on theatrical performances, created sports leagues, and maintained their military structure and discipline. The Battle of Bowmanville became part of camp lore, discussed and debated among the prisoners. Some viewed their resistance as a moral victory, a stand for principle. Others saw it as a futile gesture that had accomplished nothing except bruises and a soaking. But all of them remembered it. Otto Kretschmer, the U-boat ace, spent the remainder of the war planning elaborate escape attempts that never quite succeeded. He and other officers dug tunnels, forged documents, and gathered intelligence about the surrounding area. None of their plans came to fruition, but the efforts kept their spirits up and maintained their sense of being active participants in the war rather than passive prisoners. Kretschmer was finally repatriated to Germany in late 1947, more than 2 years after the war ended. The shackling controversy that had sparked the Battle of Bowmanville was eventually resolved through diplomatic channels. The Swiss government, acting as a neutral intermediary, facilitated negotiations between Canada and Germany. Both sides agreed to cease the practice of binding prisoners. The photographs of shackled soldiers that had inflamed public opinion on both sides were quietly archived. The propaganda value had been exhausted, and both governments recognized that continuing the practice served no military purpose. Looking back across the decades, the Battle of Bowmanville offers lessons that transcend its specific historical moment. It demonstrates that escalation is not inevitable, that cycles of retaliation can be broken with creativity and restraint. It shows that soldiers are capable of fighting without hatred, of subduing without slaughtering. It proves that national character, that somewhat nebulous concept, can manifest in concrete actions, that being Canadian meant something specific in that moment, something that involved hockey sticks and a preference for solving problems with minimum bloodshed. The battle also serves as a reminder of the human dimension of war. History often focuses on great leaders and major battles, on strategic decisions and turning points. But wars are fought by individual soldiers making moment-to-moment choices. The Canadian Guards who grabbed hockey sticks instead of rifles, the German officers who chose to surrender rather than force a bloodbath, these individual decisions collectively shaped the outcome. History is made by millions of such small choices, most of which are never recorded or remembered. In the grand narrative of World War II, the Battle of Bowmanville is barely a footnote. It did not affect the outcome of any major campaign. No territory changed hands. The strategic situation remained unchanged. But for the men who were there, it was a defining moment, proof that even in the darkest period of human history, reason and restraint could still prevail. The hockey sticks that were used that day were just ordinary sporting equipment, mass-produced pieces of wood and laminate designed for a game played on frozen ponds and indoor rinks. But in the hands of Canadian soldiers facing an impossible task, they became symbols of something larger. They represented improvisation, creativity, the refusal to accept that violence must always escalate to its most lethal form. In a war that saw cities bombed into rubble, civilians massacred, and entire peoples targeted for extermination, the Battle of Bowmanville stands as an anomaly. It was a moment when the rules were followed, when the restraints held, when soldiers on both sides remembered that they were human beings with codes of honor and duties to uphold. It was not typical of World War II, which is precisely why it matters. It shows what was possible even in that terrible time, when good judgment and basic decency prevailed. The weather on October 10, 1942, was cold and overcast, typical for southern Ontario in mid-autumn. The leaves had already fallen from most of the trees surrounding Camp 30. Winter was coming, as it always does in Canada, and the men inside the camp, both guards and prisoners, knew they faced months of cold and isolation ahead. None of them could have predicted that this ordinary October day would become part of military history. When the 1st Canadian Guard picked up a hockey stick that morning, did he laugh? Did he think it was absurd? Did he understand that he was about to participate in something that would be remembered and retold for generations? Probably not. He was just a soldier following orders, using the tools available to him, doing his job the best way he knew how. That is what soldiers do in every war in every era. They adapt, they improvise, they make do with what they have. The German prisoners who barricaded themselves in the mess hall were similarly unaware of their place in history. They were defending their honor, refusing what they saw as unjust humiliation. They were following their own code, their own understanding of what it meant to be soldiers and officers. They could not have known that their resistance and the manner in which it was overcome would become a story told and retold, a peculiar chapter in the annals of warfare. What happened at Camp 30 on that October day was simultaneously utterly unique and perfectly predictable. It was unique because nowhere else, in no other war, had soldiers fought such a battle with such weapons. It was predictable because it embodied the national character of the participants, the German insistence on honor and hierarchy, the Canadian preference for pragmatic solutions and minimum necessary force. The battle lasted 5 hours, but its effects rippled outward for the rest of the war and beyond. It influenced how other POW camps handled disciplinary issues. It became a case study in conflict de-escalation. It provided material for military historians studying the application of force in non-combat situations. It entered the folklore of a nation still defining its identity separate from Britain. Canada in 1942 was still finding its voice on the world stage. It had entered the war as part of the British Commonwealth, had sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers overseas, had suffered terrible casualties at places like Dieppe and Hong Kong. The Battle of Bowmanville gave Canadians something to celebrate, a moment of triumph that did not involve killing, a victory that was both martial and merciful. The hockey stick, Canada's national sporting equipment, became a metaphor. It represented toughness without cruelty, competition without hatred, physical confrontation bound by rules and respect. Every Canadian boy and girl who learned to play hockey was taught about fair play, about respecting opponents, about the code of the game. Those lessons applied that day at Camp 30, translated from sport to war and back again. In the mess hall, where the battle had raged, workers cleaned up the aftermath. Broken furniture was removed and replaced. The floors were dried and repaired. The windows damaged during the melee were fixed. Within days, the physical evidence of the battle was largely erased. But the memory remained, carried in the minds of everyone who had been there. The wounded on both sides recovered. The injuries were mostly minor, testaments to the restraint shown by both sides. A few broken bones, numerous bruises and contusions, cuts requiring stitches. The camp doctor, a Canadian military physician, treated German and Canadian patients side by side in the infirmary, united in their shared experience of pain and recovery. Some of the German prisoners who had been shackled bore the marks on their wrists for weeks after the restraints were removed. The psychological scars lasted longer. Being forcibly restrained, even temporarily, was a deep humiliation for men accustomed to command and authority. They had to reconcile their pride with their powerlessness, their military rank with their status as prisoners. It was not easy. The Canadian Guards also processed their own complex emotions. They had fought men who, in other circumstances, they might have respected or even befriended. Many of the Guards spoke German, sons of immigrant families who had come to Canada before the war. They understood the words shouted during the battle, the orders given by German officers to their men. It created a strange intimacy, fighting people whose language you spoke, whose motivations you understood. In the weeks following the battle, an unofficial truce settled over Camp 30. The guards and prisoners were more careful with each other, more respectful. Lines that had been crossed during the battle were re-established. The normal rhythms of POW camp life resumed, the roll calls and inspections, the mail deliveries and Red Cross visits, the slow passage of time waiting for a war to end. Christmas came and the camp observed the holiday with services and special meals. Canadian guards and German prisoners sang carols in their respective languages. For a few hours the war seemed distant, almost unreal. Then the new year arrived, 1943, and the war ground on. The Battle of Bowmanville faded from immediate consciousness but never disappeared entirely. Soldiers told the story when they went on leave, wrote about it in letters home. Journalists heard rumors and tried to investigate, but military censorship kept most details from being published until after the war. It was too good a story to suppress forever, though, and eventually the truth came out. After the war ended in 1945, the prisoners at Camp 30 were gradually repatriated. Germany was in ruins, divided and occupied, but it was home, and the prisoners were desperate to return. They boarded ships and trains that carried them back across the Atlantic, back to a country that barely resembled the one they had left. Many never spoke publicly about their time as prisoners, wanting to forget the humiliation and helplessness of captivity. But others, like Otto Kretschmer, eventually opened up. In memoirs and interviews they described their experiences, including the bizarre battle with hockey sticks. Their accounts helped historians piece together what had happened, corroborating Canadian military records and providing the German perspective on the events. The story took on a life of its own in popular culture. It appeared in military history books, in documentaries about World War II, in collections of unusual war stories. Each retelling emphasized different aspects, some focusing on the humor, others on the strategic and diplomatic dimensions. But the core narrative remained constant. Canadian guards with hockey sticks subduing a much larger force of German prisoners without firing a shot. In Germany, the story was received with mixed feelings. Some saw it as further evidence of German military discipline and fighting spirit, that even in captivity German officers would resist unjust treatment. Others viewed it as an embarrassing episode, a bunch of prisoners getting beaten by guards with sporting equipment. It depended on perspective and political orientation. In Canada, the story became unreservedly celebrated. It combined so many elements of Canadian self-image: resourcefulness, toughness tempered with fairness, hockey, and a preference for peaceful solutions even in violent situations. It was the kind of story that defined national character, true or not, and it had the advantage of being absolutely true. Modern historians have analyzed the Battle of Bowmanville from multiple angles. Military historians examine it as a case study in crowd control and riot suppression. Diplomatic historians see it as an episode in the larger saga of prisoner treatment during World War II. Cultural historians view it as a moment when national identity crystallized in action. All of these perspectives have validity. What is undeniable is that the battle happened, that it was resolved without fatalities, and that it became part of the historical record of both Canada and Germany. The hockey sticks used that day may be scattered or lost, but the story they represent endures. It is a story about finding alternatives to lethal force, about maintaining honor and discipline even in captivity, about the strange twists of fate that occur during wartime. The Battle of Bowmanville reminds us that wars are fought by people, not abstractions. The Canadian Guards had families, hopes, fears. The German prisoners had the same. They were enemies because of politics and ideology and the accident of nationality, but they were also just men trying to survive impossible circumstances with their dignity intact. For 5 hours on a cold October day they fought each other, and then it ended and life went on. In the final analysis, the Battle of Bowmanville matters because it shows what human beings are capable of when they choose restraint over excess, creativity over brutality. The Canadians could have killed the rioting prisoners. They had legal authority and overwhelming firepower. They chose not to. That choice defines the battle more than any tactical detail, more than the numbers involved, more than the outcome. Similarly, the German prisoners could have attempted a mass escape or fought to the death. They chose to surrender when continued resistance became pointless. That choice too speaks to their character and values. Both sides made decisions that preserved life and upheld their respective codes of honor. Wars create conditions where the worst of human nature can flourish, where atrocities become routine and cruelty becomes policy. But wars also create opportunities for the best of human nature to emerge, for courage and compassion to shine through the darkness. The Battle of Bowmanville was one of those moments, a brief spark of decency in a war filled with horror. The men who fought there on both sides are mostly gone now, claimed by age and time. But their story remains, a testament to their courage, their resourcefulness, and their humanity. They fought a battle unlike any other in military history, and they did so in a way that honored both their duties and their consciences. So when we remember the Battle of Bowmanville, we should remember the hockey sticks, yes, because they are memorable and unique. But we should also remember the men who wielded them and the men who faced them, all of them doing their best in an impossible situation, all of them proving that even in war there are choices and those choices matter. That is the lesson of Bowmanville, the truth behind the legend, the reason the story endures. October 10, 1942. Camp 30, Bowmanville, Ontario. A battle was fought. No shots were fired. No one died. And that, in the end, is why we remember it.